I'm about to start a war in the comment section among you Florida Gator fans. So 3 years ago, back in November of 2021, Florida fired head coach Dan Mullen. Dan Mullen took them to 3 New Year's Six bowl games. He was 2-1 in those bowls. He also won 10 and 11 games his first 2 seasons. And then in 2020, he loses to Alabama in the SEC championship. They finished the season out 8-4 after, for the majority of the season, looking like a prime playoff contender. And then in 21, everything that could have went wrong for Dan Mullen went wrong and then some. And they fired him. And everybody says that Dan Mullen had to get fired because he can't recruit and he just isn't that great of a coach. Despite the fact that Dan Mullen, for a coach who couldn't recruit, his recruiting classes at Florida, first year 2018, 14th, 2019, top 10, 9th overall according to 247, 9th overall again in 2020, and they finished 12th his final season at Florida. But Billy Naiper, the dude who Florida hired to replace Dan Mullen, because going 8-4, 11-2, and 10-3, and having a 34-15 overall record wasn't good enough, so they bring in Sunbelt Billy, or G5 Billy, who was a really hot head coaching candidate at the time. All right, there were a lot of big-time programs who wanted Billy Naipier's services. So the decision to hire Billy Naiper wasn't a bad one. It's just a decision that hasn't looked like an upgrade from what you had previously and Dan Mullen. And for everybody that says the recruiting was so bad under Dan Mullen and it's a large reason why he had to go, where's the improvement in recruiting under Billy Naiper? Because if anything, you've gotten worse when it comes to recruiting. Dan Mullen's average recruiting rank at Florida during his 4 seasons with the program was 11th. Do you know what Billy Naipier's average recruiting rank is on an annual basis his first couple of years down in Gainesville? It's 15th. He was 18th in recruiting in 2022. They finished in 13th, 2023. And this season, or this past recruiting cycle, after Florida started out really hot, they were like top 5 or in the top 10. And then all of a sudden, they fall out of the top 10 recruiting and they find themselves finishing at 15th. And not just is the recruiting taking a step back from what it was under Dan Mullen to Billy Naiper, but the on-the-field product as well. Say what you want to about how the team quit on Dan Mullen in his final games at Florida. One thing that you can't deny is that the dude was a pretty solid coach. He won games for Florida. He took you to 3 New Year's Six bowl games his first 3 seasons. You fired a coach that in 3 years at Gainesville or at Florida, he went 10-3, 11-2, 8-4, taking you to the SEC championship, which you were pretty competitive in that game, by the way, against Alabama that year. And instead, you say, you know what? It's not worth giving this dude an extra year. But yet, you're giving Billy Naiper his 3rd season after this program has done nothing but been stagnant and decline. I mean, like, the play calling for Billy Naiper, because not only is he the head coach, but he's the play caller, is atrocious. Everybody said that Anthony Richardson held Florida's offense back in 2022, Billy Naipier's first season at Florida, right? Well, tell me why Anthony Richardson ended up being better in the NFL, only playing in a few games with the Colts than what he ever did with the Florida Gators. If Anthony Richardson wasn't really that good for Florida, then him making the transition from college to pro should have been a lot tougher than what it seemed to be for him, because he made the transition pretty seamless. Not only is the on-the-field product not great out of Billy Naiper, but you look at his staff hires. Austin Armstrong was supposed to be a huge upgrade at defensive coordinator for Florida. We didn't see any improvement out of the defense last year. The defense has been as bad as what it's been the last 4 or 5 years when you had guys like Todd Grantham calling the plays on defense. There is no improvement that Florida football is making under Billy Naiper. At least under Dan Mullen, you were going to New Year's Six bowl games. You were winning double-digit games. I mean, year one, you got destroyed in the Las Vegas Bowl by Oregon State. You only won 5 games last season. And this year, things aren't going to do anything but get harder for you because you have one of the toughest schedules, if not the hardest schedule in college football. Like, God bless Billy Naiper this season. But is it really outrageous to say that maybe Florida, pulled the trigger on firing Dan Mullen way too soon? For everybody that says Dan Mullen can't recruit, Billy Naiper says, hold my tea, he's been a worse recruiter. And with the current state that college football is in now, where recruiting isn't really as big to building a championship team now as what it used to be, because you can build a team through the transfer portal. Look at the approach that Mike Norvell has taken at Florida State. He's brought in a couple of good recruits, but he's also mixed that in with a couple of good transfers and not guys who are just one and done grad transfers. He brought in Jordan Travis, developed him. Same thing with Johnny Wilson. You look at what Lane Kiffin is doing down there in Oxford, Mississippi at Ole Miss. He's doing the similar thing that Mike Norvell has done the last couple of years at Florida State. Mixing recruiting with getting in guys from the transfer portal that have 3-4 years of eligibility left, develop them, bring in a couple of one and done guys out of the portal, and build your team up that way. Dan Mullen, there's no reason why you can't tell me that he wouldn't have been able to successfully utilize the transfer portal. And let's not act like Dan Mullen wasn't held back somewhat internally by Florida's program, because when Billy got to Florida, everybody makes the excuse for Billy Naiper how he wasn't able to figure out how to get along with the boosters for NIL when he first got on the scene for Gainesville. Facilities were being revamped. If you're going to use that same argument to make the defense of Billy Naiper, you got to have the same energy with Dan Mullen. Because if the NIL backing was problematic for Billy Naiper, do you not think that things were just a little bit worse for Dan Mullen? And then they didn't really have a lot of great facilities at the time neither. You see, Florida has this philosophy that they believe that with the right coach, they should be an immediate contender in like 2-3 years. And maybe you're not the same program that you once viewed yourself to be. And it's a harsh reality to swallow because I'm a Miami Hurricanes fan, and I understand that what we are in 2024 is not anything that we were in the early 2000s. And that's okay, because when expectations go down, you have to change your philosophy about how you go about handling your head coaches. Jim McElwain wasn't that bad, but I can understand firing him. He just was subpar at best. But Dan Mullen, you fired the guy who in his first 3 years took you to 3 New Year's Six bowl games consecutively. You had 2 double-digit back-to-back double-digit winning seasons. And then, yeah, he had an 8-4 season. Things went off the deep end. And the second half of 2020, that was a weird year. And 2021, things really took a turn for the worse. But he just had 1 losing season out of his first 3 being pretty successful. And yet, he doesn't get the benefit of a doubt. Oh, well, maybe firing him would just be a little bit too premature. Let's give him 1 more year to figure things out, because it's not like the dude isn't 34-15. But meanwhile, Billy Naiper is 11-14 his first 2 years at Florida. And please don't give me the shit about how Dan Mullen left Florida in such a bad situation that it was going to be impossible for Billy Naiper to succeed. Like, let's cut it out. Okay, we need to cut it out. And I really believe that a lot of Florida fans who try to make it seem like Dan Mullen is a bad coach, they really just don't want to come to the reality that maybe Dan Mullen just wasn't a good fit for Florida. But he definitely is way better than Jim McElwain, than Will Muschamp, and definitely Billy Naiper. In the last decade, Dan Mullen has probably been the most successful coach that Florida football has had. So we look at the decision to fire him 3 years in the future, present day now, March 9th, 2024, it was a really impatient move by Florida. And it's a move that has backfired majorly in their face. Billy Naiper still learning on the job. He's nowhere as good as an X's and O's guy as Dan Mullen was. Do you remember the time when people actually truthfully believed, not a lot, but a good amount, that Dan Mullen was a better coach than Kirby Smart? Because he was just better at the X's and O's. He was better on the whiteboard than what Kirby Smart was? Now, although that was a stupid statement and a stupid opinion that many people had, that just goes to show you that many Florida fans were very high on Dan Mullen. And just firing him after one 5-6 season when we see guys like Sam Pittman still getting multiple opportunities. You know, you're giving a third season to a guy that has showed no promise. There's nothing about Billy Naiper that as a Florida fan should give you reasons to believe that he's the guy to get this program back to the national championship. I mean, recruiting has gotten worse. It already wasn't that great in a lot of you people's opinions under Dan Mullen, and it's even worse under Billy Naiper. So what does that show? We think back on the move to fire Dan Mullen, and we all feel like it was necessary because you think about how things were starting to turn left ever since the season before 2021. And 2021, you start off hot, then you lose to LSU's JV team thanks to Marco Wilson throwing somebody's cleat like it was a damn 3-point shot. And then, you know, like you lose your final game of the season, well, the final game of the Dan Mullen era to Eli Drinkwitz in Missouri. But Florida, to me, made an emotional decision. It was not necessary to fire Dan Mullen. It really wasn't. You're firing this dude after one losing season? And for everybody that says it was a necessary firing, what about this move has benefited Florida? How is Florida a better program now under Billy Naiper than what they were under Dan Mullen? Because to me, it looks like this program has further fallen under Billy Naiper. Because under Dan Mullen, they definitely weren't going 6-7 and 5-7 every season. They went 5-6 Dan Mullen's final season. Previous 3 years, he got fired after going 8-4 SEC championship appearance, 11-2 New Year's Six Bowl win, 10-3 New Year's Six Bowl win. So you get a head coach who has a winning record. He's pretty successful at every program he's been, and you replace him with the guy that doesn't have a lot of experience at coaching at a school, at a job of this magnitude when the expectations are so high. Billy Naiper worked his way up. You forgot what he was doing at Mississippi State with Dak Prescott. Imagine if Dan Mullen was the head coach of last year's Florida team. I promise you, that offense would have been so much better. Hell, if Dan Mullen would have gotten at least one more season to make things work with Anthony Richardson, like we get it that he had a lot of favoritism towards starting upperclassmen. All right, he didn't want to move on from Emory Jones when he should have, and we get that. But with Anthony Richardson being the QB1 for Florida in 2021, Florida possibly could have won 8 games. Like, what are the biggest wins of Billy Naipier's Florida tenure up to this point? What, beating Tennessee at home this year? Beating Utah at home? What are the big road wins that Billy Naiper has had? Hasn't had any. He's had a lot of embarrassing losses, though, and a lot of boneheaded decision-making and play calling. I mean, Billy Naiper, I like him. I'm not rooting for him to fail. I actually thought Billy Naiper was going to succeed. I say this so many times every time I talk about Billy Naiper, so I can prove to you guys I'm not a hater. Go watch my older videos. I was a big fan of his when he was coaching at Louisiana, when he had Levi Lewis and Elijah Mitchell, and they were winning the Sun Belt Conference. But looking at how recruiting hasn't improved, and that's been the biggest selling point for Billy Naiper, how he was a coach who was always going to have Florida prepared in every single game. That hasn't been true. Every selling point for Billy Naiper that was made when Florida made the decision to hire him a few years back has been mute points. We haven't seen anything that makes Billy Naiper a special head coach and a coach that should give Florida fans reason to believe he's the guy to turn it around. You fired Dan Mullen way too soon. And I think that it's fair to say that at this point, because the Billy Naiper experiment has been a total disaster. Recruiting's going down. The on-the-field product has gone down. Like, I get it. You're Florida football. If you believe that you're better than 8-4, 5-6, making it to the SEC championship, making it to 3 New Year's 6 bowl games, that's understandable. But you would think that your next hire would be a guy who could, without a question, get Florida back to the upper echelon of college football, being in the playoffs, being a national contender, playing in more big games. But that hasn't been the case. Florida was more relevant and they were a better program under Dan Mullen than what they are right now under Billy Naiper. I really don't think it's too much of an opinion. The facts and statistics back it up too. Billy Naiper has won less games his first 2 seasons at Florida than what Dan Mullen did. And 2, recruiting has been worse under Billy Naiper than what it ever was under Dan Mullen, for a guy who everybody yelled at you every day couldn't recruit to save his life. And who cares if Billy Naiper didn't inherit a lot of talent? You know, if this dude is a good coach, he should be able to make do with what Florida has. It's not like Florida just has a dog shit roster. You know, at best, Florida the last 2 years should have been a 7, maybe 8-win team. Dan Mullen is one of those coaches that, with how good he is at the schematics and the X's and O's side of the game, he can elevate a team that doesn't have great talent. You know, and it's not like every recruit that Dan Mullen brought in didn't work out. You know, yeah, the recruits that he brought in, a lot of them had off-the-field troubles and whatnot, but there were a fair share of gems that he had. Jason Marshall, Kyle Pitts. I mean, it's not like every recruit part of Dan Mullen's recruiting classes at Florida was a dud. I mean, how many freshmen are making impacts for Florida right now? You know, like Billy Naiper hasn't done a great job at recruiting nor a player evaluation. So looking back on the decision to fire Dan Mullen 3 years after the firing took place, right now, to me, it's safe to say that Florida made a huge mistake firing Dan Mullen, and they fired him way too soon. They gave him the pink slip way too early. They should have given him at least one more season to figure things out, because I definitely believe that he could have. But you're giving a 3rd season to a guy that all he's done is further drag Florida football near the bottom of the abyss. And if this continues to transpire for Florida and you continue to make the wrong hires at head coach, how many more years and how many more failed head coaches is it going to take until Florida becomes what Nebraska football is right now in the Big Ten, a dead former blue blood program? I don't know if people view Florida as a blue blood, but to me they are. I don't view them as that anymore. I mean, when's the last time Florida has actually been a relevant part of the national championship picture? Haven't heard of them being in that discussion since Urban Meyer and Tim Tebow. And I was in fucking 2nd grade when Florida was winning BCS championships. So, you know, going back to firing Dan Mullen, a lot of you Florida fans are going to hate to admit it, but it was a really bad decision. And it was a move that was made out of impatience. And it was a move that, quite frankly, with how Billy Naiper is playing out right now, looked like a terrible hire and a terrible move, getting rid of Dan Mullen, the coach who won 2 New Year's 6 bowl games. He had several winning seasons. All of a sudden, he has 1 down season, and the dude gets the scissors. Crazy.